The prophet climbed the rough stone steps of the city wall, the cries of a crumbling nation fading beneath him. For months, he had been screaming at the heavens, begging for a breakthrough that never came. But on this day, he did something entirely unexpected. He stopped asking. He stopped pleading. Instead, he planted his feet on the Watchtower, looked out at the silent horizon, and decided to wait. If you have been refreshing your spirit for an answer that hasn't arrived, this is for you. The heavy wooden door was bolted shut. The entire house plunged into the thick, absolute darkness of a first-century midnight. Outside, a man pounded his fists against the wood, the rhythmic thud echoing through the quiet streets. He was desperate. A friend had arrived at his home from a long journey, starving, and his own cupboards were completely bare. He yelled through the cracks in the door, begging his neighbor for just 3 loaves of bread. From inside, a muffled, annoyed voice shouted back, telling him to go away, that the children were asleep, that the door was locked. To the ancient Judean crowd listening to this story, this was scandalous. Hospitality was a sacred duty. A neighbor refusing to help would bring shame on the entire village. They would have gasped at the sheer audacity of the man inside. But the shock of the story wasn't just the refusal. It was the relentless, shameless pounding of the man outside, who refused to take silence for an answer. He kept knocking until the neighbor finally got up, not out of friendship, but just to make the noise stop. Which character are you right now? Are you the one standing in the dark, knuckles bleeding, wondering why the door to your breakthrough remains stubbornly closed? There comes a defining moment in every season of waiting when the nature of our prayer has to change. You know the exact kind of prayer I am talking about. The frantic, desperate, tear-stained pleas, where you are begging the Lord to fix the situation right this second. The prophet Habakkuk knew that kind of prayer intimately. His nation was falling apart. Violence was everywhere, and it seemed like heaven had gone completely deaf. He had spent an entire chapter of his book crying out to a God who seemed distant. But then, something profound shifts in his spirit. He realizes that panic isn't a strategy. Pleading out of sheer desperation isn't moving the hand of God. So, he makes a radical decision that changes the entire trajectory of his life. In Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 1, he declares, "I will stand at my watch and station myself on the ramparts. I will look to see what he will say to me, and what answer I am to give to this complaint." He physically and spiritually changes his posture. He stops running around in a panic. He stops throwing words at the ceiling. Instead, he climbs up to the watchtower. He stations himself. He positions his spirit to receive. This is the watchtower strategy. When your breakthrough is delayed, sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is stop talking and start looking. Stationing yourself means you are no longer reacting to the chaos around you. You are elevating your perspective above the immediate crisis. You are pulling yourself out of the valley of despair and climbing up to a place of spiritual vantage. Maybe you have been pacing the floor of your living room, exhausting yourself with worry. The Watchtower strategy requires you to plant your feet, quiet your soul, and watch. It is a transition from a posture of frantic begging to a posture of expectant observation. You are telling the spiritual realm, "I have made my request, And now I am going to stand right here and watch how my God is going to handle this. The hardest part about standing on that watchtower is the silence that follows. When you first make the decision to trust God's timing, there is a rush of adrenaline. You feel faith rising up inside you. But then, an hour passes, a day passes, a month passes, and the horizon remains completely empty. It is in this exact space, the agonizing gap between the prayer and the provision, that the enemy loves to whisper his most toxic lies. He will tell you that the delay is a denial. He will try to convince you that God is angry with you, or worse, that he has simply forgotten about you altogether. But we have to understand the ancient reality of the watchman. In Psalm chapter 130, verses 5 to 6, the psalmist writes, "I wait for the Lord. My whole being waits, and in his word I put my hope. I wait for the Lord more than watchmen wait for the morning. More than watchmen wait for the morning." Notice the repetition. The watchman in the ancient world had the most grueling job. He stood on the city wall during the darkest, coldest hours of the night. His eyes strained against the pitch-black darkness. Every shadow looked like a threat. Every gust of wind sounded like an approaching army. But the watchman never panicked because he knew one absolute, undeniable truth: the sun was going to rise. He didn't know exactly what minute the first ray of light would break over the eastern hills, but he knew the morning was inevitable. When you are standing on your spiritual watchtower, and the darkness of your situation feels suffocating, you have to anchor your soul to the inevitability of God's faithfulness. The silence you are experiencing right now isn't the absence of God. It is the deep, unseen preparation of God. He is working in the dark. He is rearranging circumstances you can't see. He is shifting hearts you can't access. He is preparing the provision for the exact moment you will need it most. Your job isn't to make the sun rise. Your job is simply to stay on the wall and keep your eyes